And thank you for
Hey,
that excellent introduction and letting people know of my new affiliation. And for those people who are in the Boston area, I'm also want to let people know that I've moved cities as well. So very glad to be here today. So what I wanted to do, and this builds on work, I'm glad Jeff is here or was here, because this builds on work that his team did at Nesta and that our team has been doing at the GovLab for a number of years, which is to begin to focus on the intersection between AI and CI. And so what I want to do today, in large part, although I'll end with talking about a specific experiment, is to talk more generally about the proposition for building more of a field that's in the intersection between the two areas of artificial intelligence and collective intelligence, and to really make the pitch to this community to do more to talk about collective intelligence with those people who are in the world of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So most of the discussion that we see, at least in the public debate around artificial intelligence today, tends to be around, especially in academic circles, as well as in newspaper headlines, tends to focus on questions of the dangers of artificial intelligence. So we hear all the time about the dangers of algorithms, about the way that algorithms can discriminate against us, that algorithms can't recognize faces of color, they don't do well with women, they definitely don't do well at the intersection between women of color. We are using algorithms to deprive people of their liberty. We're using algorithms to also discriminate against people in the hiring process, and there's now increasing legislation and regulation, at least at the local level in the United States, being pursued to prevent uses of algorithms in things like the hiring and selection process. And we worry about algorithms being used to deprive people of their liberty, to deprive people of their civil rights, and to increase the surveillance state that we worry about. So you see discussions, particularly among policymakers, that we need to address our rights in an AI world, by which what people always mean is the question of how do we regulate AI? So that tends to be the topic. And again, that discussion is deepened and accelerated by books that warn us, often in histrionic ways, about the dangers that AI can perpetuate. And then even when those books are very measured in their approach, still, I think correctly, worry about the uses of technology that we develop that are designed really not to advance the social good, that are not beneficial for society, but that instead are technologies that we develop for their own sake. So in Rob and Mehran and Jeremy's book, they really talk about the kind of tendency in Silicon Valley to want to design tech because we can, rather than because it's what technology needs, and that there's a tendency among engineers to optimize for what tech can do. And we have books, of course, like The Chaos Machine, which I think rightly describe the dangers at the intersection between the development of technology and the business models of social media that really can end up bringing out the worst. But then there is, by contrast, another story that we hear perhaps less in the headlines and more in wonkish circles about the ways in which AI is helping us to do things better in government in more efficient ways. So I won't go into any of this in detail, but just to say that we're interested increasingly in the ways in which we can do things faster in government, like spot fraud, waste, and abuse, because we can count better, as they're doing in Brazil, to be able to use AI to spot things like fraud in government purchasing. Or we can think about AI from the perspective of computer vision, and we think about the ways that our postal system sorts the letters that comes to us. That's all done using AI that helps us get our mail. And we see lots of increasing uses of AI, again, not only at the national level, but even at the local level, to help make things more efficient. But what I want to put in a pitch for today is to move beyond these headlines and to really begin to explore this boundary further between artificial intelligence and collective intelligence, in order to look at the ways in which we can reinvent democracy and reinvent the way groups work together online for the benefit of our much beleaguered democracies today, by virtue of taking advantage of artificial intelligence. So here I'm stealing a graphic from Nesta that really just intends to illustrate some of the various features that AI provides. But let me go into my own list here and a couple of quick examples to really illustrate some of the interesting use cases that I think merit further discussion and greater collaboration between the two fields, greater than at least we're seeing today. So of course, there's the way in which, and this is not a new feature, we can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to deduplicate records. And that's something that's been done over the years for a long time in the context of trying to improve something like the way citizens comment on pending regulations in the United States. So since 1946, Americans have the right to comment on draft regulations, of which there are many, many, many more than there is legislation. So we pass a few hundred, increasingly few pieces of legislation in the United States. We pass thousands of regulations that regulate everything from air quality to water quality. And this is a place where we have the right in our democracy to comment and to offer feedback. But the challenge with this process is, first, for the most part, nobody knows about it and nobody participates. But then very occasionally we have these rules like the pending rule on net neutrality a few years ago, or the rule on whether you can use a snowmobile in a national park, that get a lot of press and therefore get a lot of comments. Get, in fact, millions of comments, as the net neutrality rule did. It got 22 million comments, but only 6% of those comments were unique. And so that's a place where AI can come in to help us deduplicate those non-unique records, to help us make sense of that information, and to make it therefore easier for rule writers to read what citizens are sending in, and therefore make citizen engagement more meaningful. Now, tech is only half the battle. I had a conversation with the White House this week because I submitted a comment in response to a pending rule. And they called me up and said, we were told by the lawyers not to read the comments. So that's a different rationale, but it's very hard for the people on the other end to make sense of this incoming input. And so there are people like Stuart Schulman who spent time years ago developing these algorithms, as he's done, to deduplicate these rules and to make it possible to parse out what's truly original and make it therefore make it easier for the rule writer and make it more meaningful to citizen to be able to participate. And so we have lots of these technologies that are developing to deduplicate records that can make it much easier to enlist citizen engagement at scale. So related to this, though, is the feature that I would say is not just deduplication, but also summarization. So if we talk about wanting groups of people to participate in democratic processes, as the State Department did when it asked residents for their input on how to improve the process of applying for a passport in the United States. And so they heard from thousands of people, but it can be hard for a beleaguered bureaucrat to make sense of all of that input. And so they enlisted the help of an Israeli AI company to help them summarize the input that they were getting. And there's lots of great new summarization tools, natural language tools that are being developed by Google and Microsoft, among others, have all developed new natural language tools that can make it possible then to take the quantity of text that we're getting from people and actually make sense of what the topics are within those texts, summarize it, and make the input more meaningful. Lots of great experiments, and I'm sure we'll be hearing about some over the course of this week relating to sentiment analysis that are focused on trying to, as it sounds like, get a sense of how people feel about something. And that is related to the work that Deb Roy has been doing at MIT that I just want to single out with a project called Cortico, where he is applying AI and machine learning tools, big data analysis tools, to be able to understand the sentiment of citizens sitting around a table and engaging in a deliberation. So they talk around a table, and then a data collection device records what they say and makes sense of that information. It enables both summarization, but also then greater understanding of the sentiment of how people feel about an issue that can provide very useful input for policymakers as part of this project. The tech is called Cortico and the project is called the Local Voices Network. There are commercial outlets like Zen City who are doing something similar to help local governments understand the input of residents and how people feel about policies or services or politicians or their city. So then there's annotation and the ability of groups now to work together online to be able to comment on and mark something up, as the German federal government did when it collaborated with us at the GovLab and with the Harvard Berkman Center on using Hypothesis, an annotation tool, to comment on its draft federal government strategy on artificial intelligence. So it made the ability to use effective commenting tools driven by machine learning, made it easier to enable people both to comment and then to make sense of those comments in a written way. Let me just close out with a couple of last examples here. I think AI makes it much easier for us to think about sorting and organization. And not just about summarization or deduplication. So I'm on the board of a small Belgian company called Citizen Lab. And what they do is they provide machine learning tools that help to do this kind of clustering or topic modeling that help us to better understand and sort opinions that citizens have in a deliberation. And we see this kind of clustering used by groups, also by platforms like Polis and by groups like Taiwan's digital agency, which are using AI tools again to be able to cluster how do people stand in response to, in this case, 26 pieces of national legislation that the V Taiwan project has been used to help citizens to participate in authoring. So, and again, another example of the same, Your Priorities out of Iceland does something very similar with its open source tools that are used again to help cluster pros and cons and perspectives on different legislation. It's also just from this week, some of you may have seen in Scientific American, this article from Ariel Prakashya at Harvard, who talks about the ways in which, we might use algorithms and machine learning to better help us sort and organize the selection of residents in a sortition process. So he talks about the new movement around citizen assemblies and the very exciting development of using sortition and random selection of citizens to be able to participate in a democratic process. But he powerfully makes the case that our attempt at building representative samples is actually very skewed, is actually very difficult to do in practice because the pool from which we're selecting may not be effectively representative. So the piece that he has in Scientific American this week, it's actually in the next issue, sorry, it's already online, but it will appear next week in print, I imagine, really focuses on the ways in which we might use algorithms and machine learning to help us make sortition a truly more representative process than it is today. Finally, and lastly, and this is where I want to close, by also talking about a specific experiment. A lot of this that we've looked at, these examples of the ways in which technology can help make group processes now more effective at scale and help make participatory and deliberative democracy more efficient to do at larger scale, really comes down to a coordination exercise. So I think it's worth distinguishing between annotation and deduplication and summarization as very unique features. But there are also ways in which we're trying to think about how we can reinvent new forms of collaboration and participation. So not simply doing faster what we've done before in democratic processes, but thinking about doing altogether different things than we've done in the past. So I've been doing some work over the last many years focused on thinking about how do we use technology to connect greater numbers and more diverse numbers of experts to government to help inform decision making. So for example, we did a project just a few months ago with the United States Congress where we used technology to connect hundreds of experts from around the world to help the US Congress think about how to engage in more evidence-based lawmaking. So in this case, not rulemaking, but lawmaking, a process which, as we know, is highly, highly politicized, highly partisan, and lacks the opportunity for legislators to actually get a lot of good information or to make sense of that information, especially in the United States, where we have eliminated the agency in Congress that used to help Congress process information and evidence, and where congressional staff are increasingly beleaguered, having to deal with a huge number of issues with a very small number of time and a very small amount of time and very few resources. So we wanted to look at ways in which we could change that process and build more evidence-based systems. And we went out and talked to lots and lots of people and brought them together into deliberative dialogues, connecting them to Congress to help inform the process. But the way in which we get those experts, which started out as a very, very manual process, and where we have started increasingly to look at how we can use data to actually increase the diversity and the scale of the experts that we can identify. That's my alarm telling me it's my 15 minutes, which is good because this is my last slide. We're now embarking on experiments in conversation with our Institute for Experiential AI at Northeastern University, and working with natural language scholars like Kenneth Church, who has ingested 250 million publications, journal articles, and is able therefore to do really interesting, he's actually a computer scientist, an artificial intelligence expert, and a linguistics expert. He does a lot of interesting work in the area that I would call natural language processing, that's focused on trying to make sense of large corpora of citations and articles. So what we're doing together is looking at how we can use citation networks, how we can use academic article networks to try to search for expertise and to test whether, by using the algorithms that he has developed for identifying expertise in articles, if that actually translates into better expertise for policymakers. So we know the process that we have used manually in the past for identifying diverse experts to connect to policymakers. Now we want to look at whether we can use AI to increase the diversity, to increase the scale, to increase the reach and the speed with which we can engage in this process of creating more collectively intelligent decision-making processes. So let me end with that and just say, I think there's a lot of really, really interesting use cases at the intersection between AI and CI. And I just want to encourage more people in both worlds to tackle the challenges that would enable us not simply to worry about how do we regulate AI, but how do we use AI to help us improve regulation? How do we use AI to help us improve legislation? How do we use AI ultimately to help us improve democracy, which is ultimately, in my view, the core question that CI needs to be grappling with at the intersection between these two fields. Thanks.